We're now ready to start the second session. I'm Allison Mankin. This is the session called Civil Society, Usability, and DNS. As a reminder, use the workshop Slack for your general comments and discussion. And if you have questions about the speaker or questions for the shared pool of Q&A, put them in the Zoom chat here with the convention +Q and -Q if you don't want to keep your question place. Okay, so with that, we're going to start with a talk called DNS Privacy versus Confronting Protocol Design Trade-offs in the Public Interest. Our speaker is Mallory Nodal of the Center for Democracy and Technology. Go ahead, Mallory.
Hey, everybody. And thanks so much for letting me present this talk. It is based on a paper that's in the works by me and Siobhan Sahib from Salesforce. And so I'm really looking forward to your comments and any questions so that we can improve the paper. So let me just get a handle on the slides. Okay. The goals of the paper are really to catalog all the tensions that folks are bringing to light when we are confronted with DNS privacy, making things like measurement and research a bit harder, the consolidation concerns, and really looking at any tensions that appear to be speaking on behalf of the public interest. Especially at the Center for Democracy and Technology, we really want to face those criticisms head on, really try to understand them and unpack them, see if a public interest approach can resolve them, and to then help inform other public interest advocates that maybe are less technical about the nuances. So we're seeing a lot of human rights organizations and so on recognize things like DOE and DOT being really good things, but we also want to make sure they're prepared to understand what some of the trade-offs might be when it comes into conflict with things like access consolidation, mitigating abuse, internet shutdowns, that sort of thing. There may be others that we haven't yet identified in the paper that I haven't then treated in the slides, but we'll get to that. So I think I've covered the first two goals, but then, I think there is a possibility to have more of a shared consensus amongst, civil society advocates or public interest advocates when tensions can't be resolved. Do we want to preference things like, DNS privacy as a, over other potentially interests and try to get closer to resolving those. But then I think what writing this paper has revealed is that there's a lot of research that is potentially being done, actually, that we just need to cite better in this paper, or that there are places where we can improve research. Great. Again, the slides, sorry. So I've mentioned just in general what the goals are, but just to get really specific, the 4 areas that we looked at. And this is also so thanks to the many people, most of you are on actually these sessions, for the hallway conversations and discussions over the last couple of years with like Roy Ansofsky and Philip Winter about, what does this do for internet measurement? What do we do about the consolidation question? Is that going to be resolved over time? We want to take seriously the issues around abuse, whether it just be, general bot activity, or if there's something to deal with at the content layer, right, where DNS is often used as a filter for legitimate use of, or legitimate restrictions to content. And then also, just to explain, I'll go into depth later, the issue around internet shutdown is that we're seeing, because censors prefer DNS to do filtering or other kinds of control that the clear text DNS provides, we're seeing that some very highly motivated censors are just shutting down the use of the protocol, which is a different approach to, say, filtering and blocking based on, content itself or the user. We're seeing protocol-based shutdown. So that's something to consider. Because it tends to lead to overblocking. Yeah, I think that's it. We'll get into it now. So like I said, we're going to go through and talk about why DNS privacy is in the public interest, of course, just to set that baseline, and then go through the 4 tensions that we see around the ability to do measurement, about the risk of consolidation, about how to now tune abuse filtering better, and then what do we do about bigger and broader shutdowns, and then we'll get into some conclusions and next steps. So so DNS privacy, obviously, we think is a big win in the public interest. It's because maybe the DNS has been sort of the last thing to really become more secured. We see a lot of pretty bad activity happening on the DNS, everything from just that's where a lot of tracking happens now, to the ways in which censorship is enacted, and just generally this is great. So we take this as a baseline good thing. We use the 2 foundational documents to make that argument, coming from the IETF. Just that internet protocols should be designed to protect user privacy in 6973, and just in 8280 also establishing that part of the public interest is trying to define what's good for a human rights-based approach, to give a little bit of to get a little bit more of a framework for where we're coming from when this, and I think a gap that we've already recognized, Siobhan and I, is that we probably need to, in the paper, define a bit better what we mean by public interest. So that can be added to our next steps on that. So the first one we want to talk about then is measurement. And what is it that's so great about it already, and from a public interest perspective, and how do we feel like it might be disrupted by DNS privacy, and as far as we can tell, what might be the solutions or easing of the tension. So public interest benefits of measurement and research, right, is that the more knowledge of network performance and operation, the better the access in general, right? If we're looking at it from a sort of capitalistic perspective, it empowers consumers and creates choice. But then also a really important one, as we heard from OniProbe, and then the last whole section, honestly, really is like, we can monitor bad behaviors that might be impacting on human rights, not just freedom of expression, where the opposite is then, of course, censorship, but privacy and even assembly, I think, can be argued to be an issue here. So however, though, there is generally, I think, an issue with research and measurement that it can come at the cost of user privacy, but that's where best practice in terms of informing users and other things come into play. But then specifically, if the data, the metadata, things like DNS queries are more private than some kinds of measurement around whether it be various, partial shutdowns, any kind of measurement, it just becomes a little bit more difficult because you can't see as much. That's just the sort of trade-off. So, if users using DOE with their browsers, and you have a, extension or an add-on that works in the browser, you might now need to actually incorporate DOE in order to continue to see that traffic coming from the user. So that's one question, right? Can existing research methodologies that use DNS actually just incorporate private DNS resolution so that they can continue to work? Are there, certainly we imagine there might be some research methodologies that can't just do that, are going to be more difficult if private DNS were ubiquitous. Some measurements just might not be possible over the network. But then I think a really interesting, more nuanced question is, what would be the preference? Because not all, for the most part, actually, one of the weaknesses of the paper, I would just say right now, is that we kind of treat private DNS generally. But I think an enhancement to the paper could be to look at the differences between DOT, DOE, DOHOT, and oblivious DNS and other things like that. So would that be better for researchers, depending on where the users use it, or would it be worse, right? Like if your browser applet, it would probably be in your best interest for users to be setting that at the browser level. But anyway, so that's measurement. Just want to, cool. Good. So consolidation, this is actually probably the hardest of all of them. So I might spend a little bit more time on this one. So the issue of consolidation, right? The concern the public interest advocates have with consolidation, right, is that the internet server position that is consolidated into a few providers is generally just economically detrimental because of antitrust, right, trends. It then a sort of similar effect is that it can lead to degrading quality of service over time for users if the incumbents are, not providing, keeping up with state of the art provision. It can over time, again, these are trends over time. We just know, right, about consolidation. It slows innovation, and then maybe more specifically to the more immediate questions around centralization of a service like the DNS is that it creates single points of failure. It can facilitate mass surveillance because law enforcement or others who want access to the data only have to go to one place or fewer places to get a lot of it. And then of course, if depending on where the services are located versus where the users are located, it highly complicates regulations across jurisdictions. So these are just some of the concerns. There actually might be more. The longer I thought about it, the more would just sort of pop up. So, and this is, we're not the first people to document this, right? So we're just trying to collect it all into one place. However, though, we realize that the consolidation question does create an opportunity. So one of the ways that you can roll out privacy respecting protocols to as many people as possible without a whole lot of, onus on the end user to configure this all themselves and be very, very savvy, is that you have like a huge market share and you are a browser and everybody uses a browser. And, if you set it as a default option, then, you've got lots and lots of people now using more privacy respecting protocols than you had before. So that's a really great opportunity. And we want to acknowledge that is really important. The other sort of effect that we see in the sense where consolidation in terms of economics and value proposition and all of that is that privacy is clearly a business model now. It's a viable reason why, as Alec was saying, people will choose to use the, something that protects their privacy. And that's a very good thing in terms of trends over time. So that is not necessarily a bad thing. But we do want to highlight, though, that even though we're lots and lots of people are benefiting from the ways in which private DNS has been rolled out on a mass scale, there are nuanced decisions being made by a very small group of providers about how private DNS is really going to be rolled out. And so we are hoping that from a public interest perspective, we could actually really evaluate what would be best in the short term, but over time. Right. So while, browsers were really great to get it out now, what wouldn't, though, roll out at the operating system level with DOT be, better? And how do you actually evaluate that from a public interest perspective? If you sort of check out all the different trade-offs, right? And so that's one of the goals of the paper. And I'm being very vague now is because I have a lot of material to get through. The other thing, so these are some of the questions I think that I'm dancing around right now, but really specifically, we also want to take into consideration how, default settings or packaged apps or things like that can compare in this mix if the goal is, to get as many people behind privacy respecting protocols as possible. We often wonder, with the trust models, and there are multiple, right? Because the consolidated services are sort of making the decisions, is there a tendency, though, to create trust models around the intermediary, or is the user always the center of that trust model? We make a lot of assumptions on behalf of users and their trust models, and we want to avoid doing that as much as possible and actually understand what users want, or give them the ability to make those decisions themselves. But yeah, I think I'll just sort of skip to the bottom before I move on to the next slide, but just that one thing that's often said is that this is just the sort of the beginning of the rollout, and that eventually when, DNS, the answer to consolidation is more DNS privacy. But does ubiquitous adoption of private DNS really resolve this issue of consolidation over time? And like we go back to that question of, the folks who are rolling it out early are really setting they're really setting the tone for the rest of the rollout. So we just want to be conscious of that. Like, is there going to be a progression of the way in which DNS privacy is rolled out, or will it just continue to be more of the same, which might preference the early adopters? Right. Abuse. This is actually incredibly similar to measurement. So I'm not going to have to spend a whole lot of time here, but essentially the public interest benefit obviously is that we need to mitigate abusive behavior, for quality of service, obviously, but there are also legitimate restrictions at the content layer. It's really important actually in the human rights framework that there be restrictions to freedom of expression. It's not sort of the, more speech is more speech, like, the antidote to bad speech is more speech, like that is, it's not really true in the human rights framework. That's not what we believe. So, but, there's nuance there, but we leave that to the lawyers. we just want to make sure that it's possible, and that, abuse mitigation is actually quite important. But it's same with measurement, like, if the more private these sorts of queries are, the harder it is to mitigate bad behavior. It's harder to track it. It's harder to peek inside. Generally, that's good. Can abuse mitigation techniques simply just take over, resolving DOE or DOT and then continue to work? Or are there things that are actually really difficult to do now because of private DNS? The other thing that was mentioned, and I think it's a really important point, is that we've noticed that some of the best practices around that can get really complicated really quickly, which then sometimes leads to, again, the question of consolidation. Can only like large providers really handle the complicated infrastructure required to do all of this very well.
Mallory, a quick time check. There's 3 minutes to the Q&A.
You're right. So I just want to spend time on the shutdowns because I don't know that this is very well understood in what we're trying to say, but essentially that, the more we make it harder for censors to censor, the higher the stakes for the folks living in places where censorship is common, because we see then more general blocking happen. And I think that this was brought up like well before, private DNS was happening, where it was, we still had like domain fronting and other things. And the too big to block argument was a lot better understood back when domain fronting was in full use. So now without domain fronting and the too big to block argument, I think we're having to resort to other things. But then we're seeing now authoritarian governments it's not a case of too big to block, and they will just start blocking by protocol rather than by user, by IP address, or by content. So that affects more people. And that's why I think it would be considered more of a shutdown than a filtering. It's that kind of level of scale. So we're concerned that we don't have necessarily an answer or a fallback to this sort of trend. I'm happy to talk more about that. I'm not going to go through, I've been sort of trying to talk about the ways in which we think the tensions might be resolved. But just to give you an idea of where this paper is going before I'm done, we do want to put this up somewhere so that we can ask for feedback, pull requests. You can open issues with us. We want to add a section on usability and accessibility because that is a really important one that is affected by DNS privacy, is the ability to create usability. More specific usability per user and settings and all of that. I already mentioned that we want to be more specific about the different kinds of DNS privacy technologies out there when we evaluate these trade-offs. And then, I think eventually this does need to be published, like I said, to fulfill one of the goals where we get more public interest advocates to understand these nuanced discussions. I think the better. So we want to get it there. So thanks so much. I'm happy to talk more about this stuff or answer questions now or later.
Thank you for the great talk, Mallory. It's time for people to post questions or post a +Q if you'd like to ask a question using your voice. Mallory, here we go. Paul has a question. Paul Hoffman, would you like to say your question?
So this is a very minor question. I was waiting for others because this is sort of trivial. Mallory, your last question is the find appropriate venue for publication. Thank you for bringing this up. DNS privacy has caused a zillion venues for publication. I certainly don't have an answer for this, but please keep in on this because we end up just pointing at each other and we end up pointing at old things. For example, I haven't updated my DNS privacy document from ICANN in a year now and such like that. It would be lovely if this community could figure out a place at least to collect all the answers.
Yeah, well, and that's exactly what this draft is trying to do. We're trying to, from a public interest perspective, just acknowledge these tensions and try to present what a public interest advocate might come down on, or like, you know, because I think that a lot of these arguments sometimes are made as if they're on behalf of the public interest, but they may be coming from a corporation or a government for another reason to sort of undermine, you know, and I just think that we're with this trying to make that statement. But the question around venue is that it needs to be accessible to a non-technical audience, but it needs to be technical enough that it informs a nuanced debate. So, and that's, I think, you know, what organizations like Center for Democracy and Technology and others that we work with are like do well. So it could be that it winds up in the technical community. It could be that it winds up in an academic journal or like somewhere, but it's a bridge document in a lot of ways.
I wonder if we should also, just to jump in, Mallory, I wonder if we should also make it more living, given that, I mean, I feel like in the last 2 months, I've seen 2 different privacy preserving like DNS techniques. So maybe there's also something to be said about, you know, like the living nature of it.
Yeah, I'm all for like getting it published once and then continuing to update it because we'll have it in GitHub, but yeah.
All right, we have a question from Ram. Go ahead, Ram.
Hi, thanks, Mallory, for an excellent talk. My question is kind of related to the shutdown, internet shutdown parts of your talk. So I think in 2019, we saw Iran doing this, you know, like special kind of shutdown where they were blocking access to any external resource, but some resources like internally were still available. And like, you know, people kind of like equated that to Iran having its own internet, right? That's like disconnected from everywhere else in the world. So, you know, even if I had to come up with like new DNS privacy preserving protocols, have you thought about like how to make like, you know, governments that are trying to kind of have their own internet, like how to kind of advocate for them adopting these techniques?
So you're saying that like, you know, at least there is internet, even if it's just an intranet, and it would be great if there were privacy in there as well. I mean, I think that is actually what end up what might happen, that, you know, and I think that's that's not a good thing, but it is like it is partially a good thing. I don't really know what we could say about that other than we just have to acknowledge that the more we sort of create technologies that go after these problems like censorship and, you know, invasive privacy and surveillance and that sort of thing, is that it does up the ante. And it seems to be that more drastic measures, like we're going to have our own DNS, we're going to have our own internet now. Like that's a really big, that's a big investment. That is a committed, you know, regime and committed infrastructure. Like that's going to keep happening. So I think we can't continue to treat that as a side effect. It is part and parcel of what we're working on and what's going to happen as a result. And I just think we need to be more upfront about those conversations in the design phase.
We have one more question, and I think we should make the time for it. We've got about a minute left for Q&A. So Vijay?
Thank you, Allison. This is more a comment more than a question on Paul's follow-up question. I think, Mallory, from the viewpoint of where to publish, a lot of this touches user policy. A lot of this touches, you know, regulations. A lot of this touches law. So one of the conferences that I recently got exposed to was TPRC, which is a conference that tends to attract the legal community, technologists and the intersection of these. So perhaps, those type of conferences are where we can make a difference from the grassroots level to try to start educating, the legal community, the aides to the senators who, who create these, the proposals that end up getting, getting put up as bills in various Congress, state as well as federal. So just FYI.
And that's people have asked, what is TPRC? And I think you'll have time to talk about that during your talk, which is not next, but comes soon after. So I think we should move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is going to be Censored Planet and Internet-Wide, our next talk, Censored Planet and Internet-Wide Longitudinal Censorship Observatory. And it's presented by Ram Sundara-Raman from the University of Michigan. Go ahead, Ram.
Thanks, Allison. Hi, everybody. I'm Ram from the University of Michigan. I'm a PhD candidate there. And first off, I want to thank all the chairs for inviting me to talk about Censored Planet, which is the global and continuous censorship observatory that we operate at the University of Michigan. So in this talk, I'm mostly going to cover results from our paper at CCS 2020 last November, with a specific focus on our measurement of DNS censorship. But I'll also talk later about some upcoming work where we measure DNS filtering of COVID-19 websites. Okay, so to start off with, what is internet censorship? So we define internet censorship as the phenomenon through which access to certain websites are blocked for users. I think there are a lot of different definitions for internet censorship, but this is like the most basic definition that we use. There is anecdotal evidence that internet censorship under this definition occurs in many countries and networks around the world. However, the Internet Freedom Community's understanding of the global state of internet censorship is sort of limited. And this is because measuring internet censorship, especially at the global level, is kind of a challenging problem. So let me give you some reasons why this is challenging. So first off, there are many different kinds of censorship methods, that is, ways through which censors can block access to information. The most common methods seen in the internet today are DNS manipulation, TCP/IP blocking, and application-layer keyword blocking. And these correspond to different parts of a client-server internet connection. Second, censorship and its targets vary widely from country to country, region to region, and even from network to network, creating the need for measurements of large scale. And finally, censorship also changes over time, which creates the need for continuous measurements. So because such global and continuous measurements have been challenging to achieve, most previous studies have focused on specific countries, especially Iran and China. Moreover, they only considered censorship at a single point in time, not accounting for longitudinal variance. So the most common method previous studies, like UNI, which we heard about from before, like the most common method that they've adopted is what we call direct measurement, where the researcher somehow gains access to a client in the country of interest to run reachability measurements. The client could be a volunteer running a particular software, or an accessible machine like a VPN server. Now, although direct censorship measurements have been very useful in the past, they struggle with a number of inherent challenges, especially when it comes to global measurement. For example, it takes tremendous effort and community involvement to get a large number of volunteers. Also, can you imagine how hard it would be for users in small towns with sketchy internet connections to continuously spend lots of bandwidth running tests to hundreds of keywords? There is also the issue of coordinating tests and making sure that all the appropriate precautions are taken. I think Mallory mentioned in the previous talk that user privacy is a big concern when it comes to measurements. What if the measurements end up needing users to test pretty dangerous websites that put them at risk of retaliation from authorities? Okay, so a recent promising line of work has paved way for safer measurements that also achieve large scale. Using what are called remote measurements, these work try to infer if two devices on the internet can talk to each other without actually controlling either of these devices. So far, different remote measurement techniques have been proposed that have the ability to perform censorship measurements, and that too at like a very large scale. These techniques, which each target measuring a different censorship implementation, selects tens of thousands of public vantage points, which are owned by different organizations. And by the way, we don't have access to any of these vantage points, but we send measurements to them, and then we try to infer censorship through side channels. So I'm going to give a brief outline of satellite or iris, which is our DNS manipulation detection technique, as an example of how remote measurements work in general. Okay, so now DNS measurement usually results in a wrong IP returned as a result of DNS query. This is known to be a very common type of censorship, since DNS queries are usually sent in plain text and are easy to identify and block. So how can we measure this type of censorship? Satellite uses open DNS resolvers as vantage points to perform measurements. From our measurement machine at the University of Michigan, we send a DNS query for a domain we are interested in to a DNS resolver in a country of interest. At the same time, we also send the same DNS query to multiple control resolvers that are trusted. So to detect DNS manipulation, we can then use a bunch of heuristics to compare features of the test measurement and the control measurement. And these heuristics include things like a direct IP comparison, a comparison of content hashes, TLS certificates, autonomous system numbers, and so on. So for a measurement to be marked as an anomaly, all of these heuristics have to mismatch between the test measurement and the control measurement. That is in step 2 and step 4. Okay, so since satellite uses open DNS resolvers, there are potentially millions of vantage points that we can choose to run measurements from. But to reduce risk, again, like keeping user privacy and user safety at the forefront, we only want to select infrastructural resolvers. That is, like resolvers that are not end user owned. So we try to use only name servers. So we get a bunch of DNS resolvers using Internetwide scans, and we use certain regex patterns to only select name servers using DNS pointer records. The idea is that these name servers are more likely to be part of big organizations. So this still gives us like high scale and coverage. We can use around 30,000 resolvers in 175 countries. And since these resolvers are part of the infrastructure, they're stable and they allow us to run measurements repetitively and safely over time. Okay, so remote measurements are great, but even they suffer from some limitations. The techniques are each specialized to detect one type of censorship, and they've only been used for a single snapshot in time. They're also labor intensive to run and suffer from problems with false positives. So to overcome these challenges with remote measurements, we've developed the Sensor Planet Observatory. So Sensor Planet uses these different remote measurement techniques to reliably and continuously collect censorship measurement data. And it performs both continuous longitudinal measurements and in-depth rapid focus measurements that analyze specific censorship events. The platform was launched in August 2018, and we've been continuously collecting censorship measurement data on 6 internet protocols in over 220 countries around the world. And we test accessibility to, I think, about 2,000 websites every week. So in just under 20, this is again like data from the paper, but at that point of time, we had collected more than 21.8 billion data points. And we expanded the scale of direct measurement platforms by over 42 to 360% in terms of number of countries. So this map shows the DNS vantage points used by Sensor Planet in January 21. And as you can see, Sensor Planet has vantage points in almost all regions, with some countries having 10,000 or more. Okay, so to resolve challenges with previous remote measurements, we adopt a modular design for Sensor Planet, where each module contributes towards performing and analyzing large-scale internet measurements. So we first select a list of vantage points and a list of domains for testing. And then, so as you can see in this figure on the slide, we select more than 20,000 vantage points each week for our DNS measurements. And these vantage points are mostly stable over time. So once we have this input list, we use a scheduler to start off remote internet measurements. And we continuously monitor system health to ensure measurement errors are avoided and that the raw data collected every week is published on our website. We also adopt methods to reduce false positives by confirming instances of censorship. So we find blog pages, such as the example shown here in the slide, using clustering techniques we previously developed. And we only consider measurements with an explicit blocking signal as evidence of censorship. So our ultimate goal was to kind of apply time series analysis on our longitudinal data to detect interesting anomalies and patterns at the country level. However, we had a couple of difficulties with this. The problem was that countries like China and Iran, with a national censorship policy, had high homogeneity in blocking across vantage points. That is, they were blocking the same websites. But some other countries like Russia and Italy were more heterogeneous. That is, like different vantage points in different networks are blocking different websites.
Ram, a time check. There's 4 minutes to the Q&A.
All right. Okay. So I'm just gonna skip through these parts, I think. So the basic idea is that we come up with a metric that represents censorship of a particular country, and then we perform 2 types of time series analysis on the smooth censorship data, which is shown here. Okay, so I'm just going to touch upon a few key findings from our longitudinal data. So we were able to identify 15 key censorship events around the world. And we saw that social media and use domains were targeted in most events. We were also able to find increasing levels of DNS censorship, specifically in more than 100 countries. And we saw that anonymization and circumvention tools were the most blocked category in DNS. Okay, so given that time is short, I'll just briefly go through some results from our upcoming paper at FC, where we studied the filtering of COVID-19 related websites in different countries using SensorPlanet. So we selected a list of 1,290 websites related to COVID-19 using search engine crawls. And then we use satellite measurements to analyze the filtering of these different websites in more than 170 countries. So in the figure here, each dot represents the average blocking rate of COVID-19 websites that we tested in a country, and the countries are ordered on the x-axis by their internet freedom score. So we saw that while countries with low internet freedom scores like China and Iran show the most blocking, we were also surprised to find significant amounts of blocking in countries with higher internet freedom scores, such as Switzerland and Croatia. So we studied this in more detail, and we found that many DNS resolutions were being redirected to block pages. And some of these, like the one on the bottom left, were generated by website filtering products, such as Fortinet's FortiGuard service. So the top block websites exclusively contained COVID-related content, and they were marked by these website filtering technologies as phishing or malicious websites. So we dug deeper to see whether these websites actually contain security threats, and we found that most websites being blocked do not actually contain any phishing content at all. And some even cite their sources and warn users of inconsistencies in the data. So we must, as a community, I think we must advocate for these filtering products to be more careful with their categorization so that legitimate websites are not incorrectly blocked for users. Okay, so just to summarize, from SensorPlanet measurements, we find several interesting takeaways, including the fact that censorship varies over time, and DNS censorship especially also occurs in countries previously thought of as free. We find that while plain text DNS queries are easy to identify and block, more advanced censorship implementations are also blocking some encrypted traffic. While at the current time, it's mostly focused on HTTPS. I think the general pattern that we're seeing is that they're trying to block all sorts of encrypted traffic. So this implies the need for circumvention tools to specifically apply obfuscation to DNS traffic to help users circumvent DNS censorship. So please head over to our website, sensorplanet.org, where we're still collecting and publishing data. And we hope that SensorPlanet data continues to be useful to the community in the years to come. Okay, So with that, I think I'm ready to conclude my presentation, and I'm ready to take any questions.
Thank you for the great talk, Ram. We don't have questions in the queue. Does anyone want to bring up a question for Ram? We have 5 minutes. We have a question from Sandra CB. Do your DNS measurements cover encrypted DNS protocols as well?
That's a great question. Not at the present moment, but that's something that we're actively working on adding. I think we're trying to test access to DOH services. So that's our next priority.
Question from BJ Gorbani.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for a great talk. If you could put the slide on one of those graphs you had that showed the size of the dot versus the measurement platforms you had in various countries. I think.
Are you talking about
this one?
Okay.
So this is, I presume that the radius of the dot specifies how many measurement points you have.
That's right.
And I was just curious that Russia, considering its size, is probably underrepresented in terms of measurement points.
Right. So the dots actually represent the number of vantage points that we had in that country, which means that's the number of different machines that we were able to contact in different networks. And yeah, so we do see a lot of open DNS resolvers in China, as seen in this website. And I agree that Russia is kind of underrepresented. So I think some of the factors that are limiting our selection, or the main factor that's limiting our selection, is the fact that we try to only select name servers. So as to only select organizational vantage points, ones that don't belong to end users. And by doing that, filtering, we are basically throwing away a lot of vantage points that we could potentially use. And I don't think I have it in the slide now, but I had a different graph where I showed the number of potential vantage points. And at that point, almost all countries had greater than 10,000 or at least 5,000 vantage points.
Thank you.
Okay, we have another question from Paul Syverson, which I guess I'll read out. Tricky questions. People trying to get good, e.g. COVID information out there might be inclined to block everything that is known, validated. Horrible from a censorship, general use perspective. Smart and good public protection and quick use of available resources perspective response. Paul, maybe you should ask the question if you don't mind unmuting, because I don't think I've gotten it across very well.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay. So what I was trying to ask is, obviously from our general perspective of, access to internet resources and all, it would be terrible to just be arbitrarily blocking, these sites. But you could understand that the people who are trying to get good information out there about COVID and recognizing the amount of bad stuff that's going, and they don't have much resources, they will just, only let through the things they know about. And, that might make sense in an expedient perspective. So I guess I was just thinking that, it might not be a sort of general, policy that they would do if they had time to be, reasonable about it. But as a, that's kind of what the question was. And because you seem to be implying that, that they need to be more careful, and maybe that's just not realistic for their environment.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think that's an especially critical question given the fact that like all the misinformation that has been online because of COVID. So I think that's a particularly relevant question.
Yeah, and this goes back to Mallory's thing about more speech is not automatically better speech. So
right. I agree with that. I think the point that we're kind of trying to say here is that many of those websites that that I mentioned are COVID-19 websites are being blocked. It's quite easy to see that they're not actually malicious or contain misinformation. Even with using multiple different categorization tools, we were able to see that many of them didn't actually contain a security threat. So
Yeah.
In reality, I think, yeah, there might be a few false positives, and that's probably fine. Like that's something that we have to deal with. But I think the amount of like just labeling, every COVID-19 website that has data about the pandemic as, blocking is like the completely wrong approach to take, in my opinion, because it really depends on who's making that decision.
Yeah, and they're probably blocking now, and they'll patch that on Tuesday.
Right, yeah.
We're about to, we have to actually end, so we'll put Jim Reed's question into the later topic. And Pallavi, I think I had kept her in the queue, had a quick question, I think. What did you investigate to determine if RPZ was involved in some of the open resolvers that were contributing to the censorship of the COVID sites?
I'm not sure what you mean by RPC.
Okay, that would be, so I think we can bring it up in the discussion. That's the policy zones.
Response policy
so it's
zone.
Yeah, so it's something that could be another avenue for investigation. Okay, let's stop now. Jim, we'll put you in at the end. The next presentation is When DNS Goes Dark, Understanding Privacy and Shaping Policy of an Evolving Protocol, which is presented by Vijay Gurbani from the Illinois Institute of Technology. Go ahead and post and start up, Vijay.
Great. Thank you, Allison. All right. I think you should be able to see my screen, and I want to thank all of you, especially Sarah and Allison, for affording us the chance to present this talk here. This is joint work between myself and Cindy at the Illinois Tech, and Anita Nikolic from University of Illinois, Henning Schulzerin from Columbia, and Radu Stade from University of Luxembourg. So this talk is based on a paper that you can see in the rectangle on the bottom that we presented on Friday at TPRC. This is one of the conferences that I recently got introduced to, and it's in a very interesting place since it's at the intersection of technology and law and other aspects that highlight technology to people who can affect it from the legal perspective. So I'm going to skip most of how DNS works, since given everybody here, I suspect most of you know how DNS works better than even I do. One thing I will note is that the protocol clearly is evolving. It was not designed with encryption in mind from the get-go, as obviously was the case with most protocols back then. But if you take a look at the evolution of the protocol, the early work on this evolution was focused mostly on infrastructure type of encryption, as was witnessed by DNSSEC and eDNS0 set of extensions. The later and current extensions in the protocol are more on privacy of the user. DNS crypt, which I suspect most of you know, even though it's not standardized, is being used. DOT, DNS over TLS, was RFC 7858 in 2016, followed by DOH in 2018 as RFC 8484, and ODO, which is currently an internet draft. And obviously today I heard about, ODO over Tor. So clearly privacy is important. The interesting thing to me as I was looking into this space was something called resolverless DNS. And I'll come back to this towards the last slide. This is more of an idea right now, and I believe DKG knows about this. It's not standardized, but it's an interesting idea nonetheless. So what we are interested in is, as this protocol is evolving, do the privacy preserving extensions enhance the user privacy, or is it mostly security theater, as Bruce Schneier says? DNS has a lot of actors. Traditionally, the main relationship was defined between the user and the access provider, and the access providers were Verizon, AT&T, Comcast, or wherever you got your access from. But that has changed. As we can see, browser vendors are a very big part of the DNS ecosystem today. From the standard sides, I mean, there's various standards organizations, ITU-T, W3C, IETF. The biggest player in this area with respect to internet protocols is obviously IETF. But more interestingly, there is now these public DNS operators that are entering the market. And depending on which study you look at, in our paper, we looked at 2 studies. One study said that Google and Cloudflare control about 50% of the public DNS resolver market, while a second one says that about anywhere from 1.5% to about 22.36% is being controlled by these public DNS resolvers. There's various reasons why these public DNS resolvers are becoming more important. One is simply the fact that many organizations no longer want to maintain a DNS ecosystem of their own for various reasons. Now, besides having a recursive resolver, they might have to provide TLS, or they might have to provide DOE to that recursive resolver. So some of the organizations don't want to get into that, and offloading that to a public DNS resolver operator is an attractive target at this point. But also more important is organizations like EFF and CDT that we heard from earlier on today, that are essentially NGOs getting into this space from the viewpoint of user privacy. And from the regulation end, we are talking about FCC and FTC from a US-centric perspective, of course. But so you can see there's lots of players here, and the question that comes to mind is, who among all of these is really looking out for the user's privacy? Is it the browser vendors? Is it the standards bodies? Is it the regulations? Because the regulations should aim for the public good. So we try to tease some of these questions in the paper. Again, I'm not going to go into detail on why to protect DNS queries, because I'm sure you're all aware of that. I will make a note that despite using DOE.odo, someone has access to a user's DNS lookup. That's the invariant. We may route through Tor, we may do something else, but somebody has access to the DNS lookups, and the more proxies and the more intermediaries we put in between, the more distance we create from the user making the DNS query and the server serving the DNS. But someone has access to the user's DNS lookups. So one of the things we looked at examining in the paper is an IP address from the privacy perspective considered PII. And interestingly enough, it appears that most of the legal regulations in place across Europe, across the United States, is that the IP address by itself may not necessarily be PII, especially because the IP address changes. For instance, even with DHCP, you can nail an IP address to a MAC address and serve the same address over time. But what became clear is that between Europe and the US, at least, these are the markets we looked at, was the idea that if the IP address can be linked to a particular household or a particular consumer, then we can consider that IP address to be PII. And if that IP address is PII, then clearly regulations like GDPR, for instance, accord a special value to that because it becomes an identifier that can be used to trace the user across various incarnations or various instantiations of the DNS lookup. So the next thing we did was we started to look at about 12 DNS providers and examine the user privacy of these DNS providers. We culled these 12 DNS providers using a methodology that's outlined in our paper. The paper, by the way, can be downloaded for free as well, or you can always send me email and I'd be happy to send it to you. But looking at these 12 DNS providers, we saw that about 9 of them had privacy policies, 3 of them did not. Of the 9 that had privacy policies, 6 had DNS-specific policies, and the rest had general policies. Now, general policies are rather muddled up because they talk about web services, they talk about third-party application, they talk about cookies, etc. We were more interested in DNS-specific policies. So given these DNS-specific policies, what we wanted to do was to see how these policies from a privacy perspective stood up under the lens of 6 GDPR articles. Now, for those of you that have examined these privacy policies, they are very hard to read. They are fairly obtuse. And I think one of the papers that we quote, or a newspaper article from NYT that we quote, said that the Google privacy policy basically went from a 3-minute read to about 30-minute read by 2018. And Facebook privacy policy is about an 18-minute read. And this is legalese read, not regular reading that would make sense to somebody who is not necessarily a computer scientist or or a lawyer. So looking at
a quick time check, there's about 4 minutes to the Q&A.
Got it. So looking at these GDPR policies, we looked at purpose limitation. Purpose limitation establishes the fundamental notion that personal data must be collected for a specific, explicit, and legitimate purpose. And it restricts the personal data to be processed only to the extent that it's compliant with the original purpose for which data was collected. So we taxonomize the reasons why the data is collected. And as you can see, it's probably okay to collect data for security and visibility, for research in the public good. But, is it okay to collect DNS data for profit? Certainly nothing, at least here in the US, stops the operators from doing so. Is it okay to collect it for marketing? Those are questions that we have to grapple with and figure out if the operators can do so. The next article we looked at was data minimization, and this essentially restricts the collection of personal data to what is necessary in relation to the purposes for which they are processed. We think that it's okay to collect data from a DNS transaction that includes the IP address of the querier, the question section, the answer section, and the timestamp, but that's about it. What we found out was that, the operators are collecting far more than that. And in fact, some operators, if you use third party on their website, for instance, or within their domain, those third parties also collect data from you. So storage limitation is the other article we looked at from GDPR. And storage limitation provides guidelines, although not strict timelines, on how long the personal data should be retained. We found out that the DNS-only privacy policies were far more stringent than general privacy policies. Most operators delete their data after 24 to 48 hours. Some sample data for permanent storage, but anonymize IP addresses or keep data at a metropolitan and city level. I will note, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it, that de-anonymizing this data, even though it's anonymized, is still feasible, as the Netflix example showed us, a few years ago. And some operators like OpenDNS and NextDNS allow users to delete their data, but it's really not clear, how users would exercise that preference. Consent was another interesting article that we looked at. Consent requires that operators that are able to demonstrate that the user has consented to having his or her personal information processed for a specific purpose. The question here becomes, what does consent mean? If I modify my etcresolve.conf and put 8.8.8.8 or 1.1.1.1, is that consent? How is the operator going to know that I've actually given them consent to to do anything with my data at all, including storing it or using it for their purposes. So consent is a gray area essentially, and I'm not sure that it meets all of the requirements for GDPR Article 17. Withdrawal is still fairly ambiguous. Some policies allow withdrawal of consent, but they don't say exactly how that withdrawal would be affected. I'm going to skip this in interest of time and talk about data transfers on the basis of adequacy. And this was basically, what are the obligations of a DNS provider when a user resides outside the provider's jurisdiction? The one thing that I'll highlight here is that, interestingly enough, none of the providers had any data transfer information in their DNS-specific policies. Google Public DNS, Cloudflare, OpenDNS, and VeriSign had Privacy Shield in their general privacy policy, but Privacy Shield, as you know, is no longer in force, even though the signed signatories must still adhere to it.
Vijay, it's really pretty much time to start the Q&A. Can you wrap up quickly?
Yes, I think I'll wrap up by some recommendations, but I want to wrap up basically by this last slide. I think the protocol is evolving, and I think early DNS extensions were more at infrastructure, later ones are more along privacy. Now, the interesting thing to me with this resolverless DNS is that in resolverless DNS, there are no resolvers. When you get back a document, for instance, from a web server, you have all of the IP addresses in the document, and you go directly to those IP addresses and don't do any DNS lookups. So if you view this as a rational game or a game between rational actors, if you pursue the dominant strategy, I believe that user privacy will be the casualty here, because with resolverless DNS, the user has absolutely no way to affect anything at all. So I think these are some of the questions that we have tried to pose in our paper and try to look at various aspects of privacy from a user-centric perspective, which is what DNS really is, because every transaction on the internet starts off with the DNS query. So I'll open it up to questions. And
Thank
sorry
you.
for going up.
We have some queued up questions, starting with a clarification question. I think we should turn over to DKG about what you meant by the IP address, right?
This is DKG. I think it was answered in the
Okay.
in the later part of the talk, so I'll pass.
Okay, and then I'm going to skip mine, but we have a question posted from Benno. Benno, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's actually one of the last slides. This one, actually, above all, the user. Oh, sorry, no, the other one. That none of the global or the. Oh, sorry, on slide. Yeah, slide 14. None of the providers any data transfer information. You put Google and Cloudflare and OpenDNS first slide. You don't say anything about quad 9. Haven't you looked at it, or do you consider that it's similar to the other open DNS resolvers?
So insofar as any operator had a DNS specific policy, and offhand, I do not know if quad 9 did or whether they had a general policy, but insofar as any of the operator had DNS specific policies, at the time that we looked at those policies, none of them said anything about data transfer on basis of adequacy.
Yeah. So yeah, that's more a remark. So from what I've learned from one of the presentations of John Todd, quad 9, they don't collect IP addresses. They translate it as fast as possible to geolocation on city-based. And for their operations, they use geo-IP information and no IP addresses, and they don't store it also. So there's no history of IP addresses.
Right.
Per se.
Right.
Of course, during the transaction and the reply, but then that's it. Yeah.
Some of the providers, yes, do not store anything, but we also ran across a provider that said we don't store anything, but yet they have retention periods. So if they're not storing anything, exactly what is being retained, we were not sure.
All right. Yep.
Tripped themselves up. I had skipped over Alec Muffett's question. What is your perspective on empowering users to prevent monopoly status of public resolvers by fomenting technologies which load balance, anonymize the PI aspects, and use a multitude of them severally. I mean, Alec, you might want to jump in and ask your question better than I
I
have.
think you did a good job of it there. Thank you, Alison.
Okay. So Vijay, do you have a comment on that question? And then we'll wrap up.
Yes. Oops, sorry about that. So I think this is a very hard question to answer in a couple of minutes. I think that, you know, I'll answer it by saying that privacy is important, I believe, more than people consider. Even though we think that privacy is not important, various sociology experiments have demonstrated that if the question was cast in a different way with different incentives, then suddenly people who said earlier that privacy was not important, it becomes important. I think the fact that GDPR, you know, by its nature is now the de facto regulation across, you know, EU for sure, but also across companies that have presence in multiple countries, and GDPR is based on privacy, I think also says quite a bit. So I don't know, you know, how to make it easier to make DNS more baked, privacy in DNS more baked in. I think, you know, a little bit of this is the type of workshops we are having right now. But beyond that, I'm not quite sure how to answer your question outside of maybe a couple pints of beer and a nice conversation.
Okay, thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk, very thought-provoking. Hopefully we will continue some interesting discussion in this whole space, also in the breakout as well as at the end. Our next talk is user expectations and understanding of encrypted DNS settings, which will be presented by Nick Feemster from the University of Chicago. Nick, go ahead and start.
Great, thanks. And thanks for the opportunity to present today. I'm going to be presenting work that is primarily that of Ali Nissenhoff, who is here actually in the workshop today. So invite you to direct some questions to Ali as well. This is a preliminary study of user expectations and understandings.
I don't think we have your slides, Nick.
Oh, okay, hold on, let me just share the screen there. There we go. This is a preliminary study of user expectations and understandings of encrypted DNS settings. I say preliminary because the sample is relatively small, 15 users in this survey. And so we plan to do a larger survey. We're in the process of designing that and rolling it out this spring. So if you have comments or feedback or questions on that, we would sincerely appreciate that in the Q&A, in the Slack, directly by email, etc. Great. So one of the reasons that we wanted to have a look at this is the trend towards turning encrypted DNS on by default, which came up as a recommendation, I think, in the last in the conclusion slide in the last talk, and that's fine. I think we probably also want to be cognizant of how defaults are set, and in particular in light of the consolidation that Mallory also talked about in her talk, what the default settings are, and whether users even know about them, and if they prefer to change them, do they know how? Do they even understand what they're doing? I think the takeaway from our work so far is that there's a lot of work to be done in educating users, in designing better interfaces, in setting defaults, etc., in all of these areas. It's worth noting before we get into some of the details of this work that encrypted DNS is being deployed in, as we know, many browsers, operating systems, etc. And in some cases, some version of it is being enabled by default, although the way that it's being enabled by default differs across browsers. some browsers, those based on Chromium, do opportunistic encryption in DNS. So for example, if the ISP supports encrypted DNS, the browser will, shall we say, upgrade to DOE. Firefox and Opera have taken a slightly different approach, essentially using Cloudflare as the default trusted recursive. I think basically that part of why we wanted to have a look at this was that last bullet. I mean, that has certainly, given some of us pause. There's increased consolidation, increased centralization in a small number of powerful companies, and many times these decisions are being made without the awareness or consent of users, with tremendous implications, as Mallory mentioned in her talk. So we're trying to get a better handle on users' awareness and attitudes about these defaults. Do they want this? Do they understand what they're getting? Do they understand the implications of some of these nuances that I just went over? If it's not to their liking, do they know how to change it? Do they know that they can change it, and so on? Just to give a sense of what these settings look like in different browsers. It's different for different browsers. That should already cause you to raise your eyebrows. Sometimes it's referred to as DNS over HTTPS. Sometimes it's referred to as secure DNS. You can see sometimes you get an option to use your current service provider. Whatever that means, you basically have to read a little bit to figure out what that is, but that's opportunistic though to your ISP. So sometimes if you basically enable it, you get that, and you have to switch down if you want a custom provider. Sometimes you just, as in Firefox, if it's enabled, you get Cloudflare. There's a drop down that allows you to change that I'll get into on the next slide. But as you can see, the interfaces differ. What we've skipped in the presentation on this slide is, where this is in the settings in the first place. It's pretty hard to find. If you get into your preferences and search for DNS, you can eventually get there. But unless you know what you're looking for, it's pretty tough to find. As far as choosing the trusted recursive, once you actually enable the setting, that also differs. So, in Chrome here, you basically get a bunch of different options. Cloudflare, Google Public DNS being our familiar ones, a couple of others. And then you can see, depending on your browser, you get different choices, right? So Edge gives you Quad 9 as a choice, as does Brave. Chrome does not. Firefox does not. You can use it. What you have to do is basically, get into the other setting and then manually enter it. So of course you got to know that it exists to get there. I think if you've gotten that far, you probably know that it exists, honestly. But this is sort of the state of the land as far as choosing a trusted recursive. So as I mentioned, this is, I'll say preliminary, or a pilot. We did a small scale study to sort of test out our set of questions, and then see what's coming back to see if there's a there. It would appear that there is. So here's sort of the summary of the types of questions that we've been studying, as well as what some of our early results are showing. Do users understand what these options do? Not always. How do users interact with these settings? Like, do they interact with them? How do they do so if they do? Usually not. That's obviously not specific to DOE. We know that from just about every study of user interfaces and HCI since the beginning of time. People tend not to change defaults. So I think that is also true here. Why do users choose the settings they do? Well, users typically have stuck with the defaults because they really lack information about the fact that this is even going on, let alone the fact that they can change it. Sometimes people are under the impression that the defaults, by changing the defaults, they would break something. Okay, so some people don't even realize that they have an option to switch it and retain functionality. When being provided with more information about it, so I think this is important. Once you educate people about what's going on, they often opt to change it. Okay, this should be pretty worrying, right? Sort of indicates that we don't have the default settings correct. And by we, I mean these companies. So I hope CDT is still here. This is not good. Given more information, users are switching the defaults. Obviously, we need a larger sample to confirm that that's a broad trend. But from what we've seen so far, I think there's work to be done. People have limited knowledge about the existence of multiple trusted recursive resolvers, as well as trust in various entities does vary across these participants. So that's kind of a summary of the paper. I'll just now get into a few of the details. I know we're running up to Q&A very soon, and so what remains in the talk is really just a deeper dive into a few of these results. I'll just briefly, here's a slide that I think you can read it since the PDF is available, so I won't read it to you. But this is basically how we designed the survey. So we showed them various options, right, from the different browsers, asked them what they would select, asked them if they'd seen it before. For the Firefox settings menus, we specifically asked them about how likely they'd be able to, they would be in modifying these settings if they knew how. If the users had a phone that supported private DNS, we asked them about their current settings. And all participants we asked all of them if they would choose this without giving them any additional information. Would you choose private DNS, without really telling them too much more about what it is? Then there's a subsequent part of the study where we explained a little bit more about what this technology was doing, right? Both in terms of what kind of privacy benefits it provides, as well as the implications for who gets to see the DNS queries. And following that explanation, we asked a bunch of different multiple choice and open-ended questions regarding their opinions on this setting, and presented the original options again and asked them which options they would choose to see, how that changed.
Nick, quick time check, 2 minutes to Q&A.
Yeah, almost done. So you can see basically in changing the settings in Firefox that a lot of people are, either somewhat unlikely or extremely unlikely to change this setting, given no additional information. Other users are without additional information would just leave the automatic settings, or the default, the automatic choice the browser or the operating system gave them. Given additional information, however, people made some different decisions, as I mentioned. Okay, good. We asked people if they knew about different DNS providers and whether they trusted them, right? And so you can see here that there are, most people know their ISP and they know Google. Most people never heard of Cloudflare even, and nobody had heard of NextDNS or Quad9. There's a significant amount of distrust, I think, of certain parties. Again, I think the somewhat level of distrust of the ISP is not surprising, given the amount of media attention that has been directed towards that. But also, I think there's a significant distrust of Google, and some people also don't trust Cloudflare. So I think, again, this is coming back to our default settings, right? And giving the users the ability to make decisions here. I think there's a lot of work to do. We're continuing in our future work to get a larger sample size, do some more extensive testing on the interfaces, and better understand what users' expectations are for each specific setting. Our general survey of expectations right now remains somewhat general and high level, and as we get into the next survey instrument, we're looking at how people what are people's expectations and understanding about specific settings. So, I mean, in closing, right? People stick with the default options, given the choice, right? Given the knowledge that they have a choice, and given an explanation about what these options do, some of them opt to change it. Also, there's a significant amount of distrust in some of the providers that are that are being set as default. And so, in order to basically really drill down further on that, we're going to need to get into a larger sample size. But I think hopefully this is the beginning of directing some attention at the default settings, the user interfaces, and other things surrounding DOE, so that we get defaults that are more respectful of users' privacy preferences. Thank you.
Okay, let's start the Q&A. We have multiple questions for Nick. So for Nick and Ali, and I'm just going to try to sort through the queue. We have the first one that came in was from Mortuza Jadiwala. You had a question for Nick. Do you want to ask it? Mortuza, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there. Hi, Nick. Great talk. My question was, and this is based on assumption that you're assuming that your participants actually know what a DNS is and what it does, and so basically,
no, we didn't assume that actually.
Oh, you didn't assume that. Okay, so
no,
so basically,
that. We actually asked that in the survey.
So so for example, if a person really doesn't even know what a DNS is, does the survey proceed at all in the ahead or?
Well,
because
yes. I mean, that was kind of the point. Is that basically we actually started with the question about whether people understood both DNS and private or encrypted DNS, and so yes, the survey proceeds. The explanation of DNS and encrypted DNS was conducted as part of the survey, and then we returned after that explanation to ask some additional questions. I see Ali's now here and on screen, so hi, Ali. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so kind of initially people were just like shown the interface, but we didn't assume that they had ever actually like heard of DNS or DOH, DOT. So after they made that initial choice, we did give them like an explanation of what DNS did, an attention check to make sure they'd actually read and understood the explanations, then like an actual explanation of kind of more encrypted DNS, kind of specifically what the implementation kind of related to private DNS, where it's the opportunistic model.
We have from DKG. Let's get DKG's question next. And I'm just trying to sort this queue. So I think we'll try to do a question from Sandra after that and a question from Ram after that. And then we may have to close the queue for Nick, but we're going to open it. We have a bunch of questions queued up for everybody. So, so DKG, your question.
Yeah, so my question was about, you're asking about users' understanding of consolidation and the risks in this space. Have you done, or do you know of anyone who's done similar attempts to study questions about consolidation in the HTTP and HTTPS delivery infrastructure? I mean, that's the thing where there isn't as much user interface exposed to the user, but users are subject to comparable amounts of privacy violation due to consolidation.
Thanks, DKG. I think that's a really good question. I wish there were more. So there was one paper in IMC this past year called "Clouding Up the Internet." I forget the authors of that paper, but you can probably find it from the title. It uses DNS, but it uses the DNS data to get a little bit of understanding of how, the extent to which certain things are hosted on specific cloud services. I think that paper is it's by no means complete or comprehensive, but it's certainly an early look at some of that. We've started to do, but I think to your question too, some of the folks in our group, I think, no, I don't think any of them are here right now, but we've started to measure the consolidation of the top, the Tranco top K, the Alexa top K, news sites, disinformation sites that are to see where they're hosted. Stay tuned, or we can chat offline about that. Very good question.
But your answer here is about how much is there consolidation happening? And my question, your study was actually about user expectations. Has anyone looked at user expectations around HTTP, HTTPS consolidation?
Ali, you want to take that one?
I don't think I've seen any papers, but there's always the chance that there are papers out there that I just don't know about on the HTTPS
okay,
side.
Thanks.
We go to Sandra's question next. We have 5 minutes before the break, so everybody should try to keep their questions a little short, and then we can move also into the more discussion. We have a whole breakout in this space. So Sandra?
Yeah, hi, great talk. I was just curious about the additional information that was provided to the users that led to them switching their options. Was it related to what provider the queries went to? What sort of concerns did users really express when they changed their options?
Yeah, so it wasn't about the specific provider that the queries were going to, since this was it was just a text-based description of what was of like the system, and since it was for private DNS, which is opportunistic, we just kind of explained to them like what was happening with the system. I can, if you just message me on Slack, I can like give you the exact wording. I don't know it off the top of my head, but I don't remember the exact. I think in the paper there's some more explanations of what people were worried about. A lot of the people that chose to stay with the automatic setting, a lot of it was about just worrying that their like phones or browsers weren't going to work if they changed the setting at all, and kind of not knowing what was going to happen if they changed it. Yeah, and I guess other people were a bit worried that like someone was going to get to see their queries and stuff. So some people might not have understood that explanation.
Paul Syverson asks, how do you know users switching indicates that knowing more show the defaults are wrong versus a little knowledge being a dangerous thing?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, we did ask like the follow-up open-ended question to see kind of what people were actually saying they're worried about. And it looks like some people didn't understand the opportunistic bit, but people kind of discussed being worried about like overconfidence and stuff and things, not knowing when it was happening.
Okay, and Sudesh Namal asked, he said, super interesting work. Do you think there's an interesting opportunity toward the education aspect of privacy to have some sort of landing page like the ones during browser updates to show users some explanations of what their settings mean?
Yeah, so I know when Firefox upgraded to Doe, they had a pop-up that kind of gave some information. So I do think when these settings are changed, like by default, it is important to give people information. Of course, you don't want to overwhelm users because they'll just kind of click through things to get it out of their way. But I do think kind of in the settings pages having a bit of more explanation, a bit more information so that people can make an educated choice would be helpful.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too to add on to that, and Ali can chime in here too. But during the course of doing this work, the pop-up design changed for Firefox in particular. It had started off with a pop-up saying like, "Hey, would you like to enable this?" This was before they had default on. Like, "Would you like to enable this setting for private DNS? To send all your encrypted DNS queries to Cloudflare." And then some months later, it became a little bit more general. Said, "Hey, I
think it was the other way.
Did it switch?"
Yeah, it's the other way. Yeah,
really?
I think they gave a little more information. Yeah.
I thought the Cloudflare wording was removed.
I'd have to check, but I think it went the other way. It's just at different points when this was being rolled out, users had different amounts of information about like where their actual queries were going, and particularly when they're all being routed to like one resolver. It's pretty important that people kind of know where that stuff's going.
Yeah.
Right, so I think we can say that anything you do further on this, the more you do, the more people will be happy to hear more about it. And I had promised that we would go back to Jim Reed and let him ask a question to Mallory. And then Paul Syverson had a question to Mallory. So we'll do those two, and everything else can go into the breakout sessions, which I'll remind you, we have a breakout session for 25 minutes for each of these sessions. And there's some opportunity during that time to go into some more depth on these papers. So Jim, what was your question for Mallory and Siobhan's paper, if you still remember?
Thanks. It's more of an observation. The interest from authoritarian regimes in the implications of DOE and other informed encrypted DNS technologies is already underway. There was a document submitted to an ITU meeting at the end of last month from Russia saying the ITU needs to do something about this. And this is almost certainly a precursor to further debates inside the ITU about getting more and more involved in this particular area. And that's going to, I suspect, figure very highly at the big ITU meeting next year, WTSA, when they decide the strategic plans and all the rest of it. So this stuff is already underway. And the fact that the Russians are pushing this is, I think it doesn't take too much of an effort to realize that other authoritarian regimes will be equally interested in trying to see this work progress there. That's it.
I can just agree with you that, and that's why I think it's important that we confront these things really directly and not talk about them as side effects, because the way that these are implemented by early adopters and tested and rolled out matters now. It's not going to matter when it's ubiquitous. These are the effects of early adoption. We have to talk about it now. That's why I included that slide.
Okay, one last question. Paul Syverson, you had posted a question about balkanization for Mallory and Siobhan's paper. Would you like to ask that question?
Well, okay, so yeah, this is not a question that realistically, this is a big, broad, open-ended question. But you were talking about, if I recall, issues about when stuff gets set up in a private space, and I was thinking, wondering about if anybody has looked at, designing protocols and not just the protocols themselves, but the ecosystem and the infrastructure, so that overall that's just harder to do. So that I mean, to some extent, people have tried to do this within particular protocols. I mean, that was the whole idea behind domain fronting to some extent. But I mean, at a sort of broader ecosystem level, attempting to make it so that the cost of splitting yourself off is just much higher. And there's of course a tension, because we try, when designing protocols, to make them testable and modular and all, just to make them work properly. So I'm not really sure that maybe you've got a real question to that. If so, I'd love to hear it, but that's what I was trying to ask about.
No, I don't have an answer, but I think that's kind of what we're trying to do, is we're trying to ask the right questions. So if you want to engage, I also just, as a point of opportunity, I've put the paper up in GitHub and tweeted about it, so you can start opening issues. We're going to try to scrape the chat and the recording for anything and add them as new issues. But yeah, engage with that section of the paper, because I think these are good questions, and there needs to be more research, because at the end of the day, there are actually quite a lot of ways in which private DNS can be rolled out, and they will probably all be used in concert in different ways and elsewhere, but they all present different trade-offs. So thanks, everybody.
Okay, let's wrap now. We have a break that's close to an hour. We've rolled into it a little bit, and the Slack is open. You can discuss some things in Slack. In the meantime, we'll have the breakout sessions later. Sarah's going to put up the speaker slides to remind you of things. And just as a reminder, it was actually a little hard to do the queue, because we had discussion showing up in the Zoom chat. So things that don't start with +Q or -Q, please put them in the Slack instead. That'll make it much easier for us to make sure we don't miss any of the questions that belong in the session. Thanks very much, and have a nice break, and we'll see you at 19:30 UTC. The speakers should be there ahead of time so you can test your screen share, and see you in a while. Thank you.